The rain was coming down in sheets that Tuesday evening in Denver, turning the streets into a blur of headlights and reflections. I should have taken the bus home from work, but I was running late for a video call with a potential client, and my car seemed like the faster option. That decision changed everything. I remember gripping the steering wheel of my Honda Civic, squinting through the windshield as I navigated the familiar route from downtown to my apartment in Capitol Hill. The marketing agency where I worked had kept me late again, but I didn't mind. At 25, I was finally building the career I'd always wanted, and the extra hours meant I was close to landing my biggest client yet. The intersection of Colfax and York was notorious for accidents, but I'd driven through it hundreds of times without incident. The light was green as I approached, and I was already thinking about the presentation I needed to finish when I got home. That's when I saw the red pickup truck running the red light, heading straight for my driver's side. Time slowed down in that terrifying way it does during accidents. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, but there wasn't enough time or space. The impact threw my world into chaos, the deafening crunch of metal, the explosion of the airbag, and then an eerie silence broken only by the hiss of steam from my destroyed engine. When I came to, I was hanging sideways in my seatbelt, my car having rolled and come to rest against a light pole. Everything hurt, but my left leg felt wrong, completely wrong. I tried to move it and gasped as white-hot pain shot through my body. Through the spider-webbed windshield, I could see people running toward me, their voices muffled and distant. The next few hours were a blur of paramedics, sirens, and hospital corridors. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, an orthopedic surgeon with kind eyes and steady hands, explained that I'd shattered my femur and torn my ACL. I needed immediate surgery to insert a metal rod and repair the ligament damage. You're looking at a significant recovery period, she said, her voice gentle but direct. 6 to 8 weeks of limited mobility, then several months of physical therapy. Do you have family nearby who can help? That question hit me harder than the accident itself. I'd moved to Denver 3 years ago for work, deliberately choosing a city where I could build my independence away from my family's drama back in Kansas. I had work friends and neighbors I was friendly with, but no one close enough to ask for the kind of help I'd need. I have a brother, I said finally, though the words felt heavy in my mouth. He lives about an hour away in Colorado Springs. Marcus was 2 years older than me, and our relationship had always been complicated. Growing up, he'd struggled in school while I'd excelled, struggled to keep jobs while I'd climbed the career ladder, struggled with relationships while I'd focused on building my life. Our parents had always pushed him to be more like me, which hadn't done either of us any favors. After the surgery, when I was groggy from anesthesia and facing the reality of my situation, I called him. My fingers shook as I dialed his number, not from the pain medication, but from the vulnerability of having to ask for help. Nick, what's wrong? His voice sounded surprised. We didn't talk often unless it was for holidays or family emergencies. I was in a car accident, I said, my voice smaller than I intended. I had surgery on my leg and I can't really take care of myself right now. I know it's a lot to ask, but could you maybe help me out for a few weeks? There was a pause that lasted forever. Jesus, Nick, are you okay? I mean, obviously you're not okay, but I'll be fine eventually, I interrupted. But right now I can't drive, can't really walk, can't carry anything heavy. The doctor says I need someone to help with basic stuff for at least 6 weeks. Another pause. Okay, he said finally. Yeah, I can do that. I'll drive up tomorrow and we'll figure it out. The relief I felt was overwhelming. Despite our complicated history, Marcus was still my brother, and in that moment I felt incredibly grateful that he was willing to help. I had no idea that this phone call would set in motion events that would change our relationship forever. The next morning, as I waited for his arrival in my sterile hospital room, I felt hopeful. Maybe this crisis would actually bring us closer together. Maybe it would be a chance to rebuild the sibling bond that had been strained for so many years. I couldn't have been more wrong. Marcus arrived at the hospital the next afternoon, carrying a small duffel bag and wearing the same distant expression he'd had since we were teenagers. At 37, he still had the lanky build of our high school years, but his face showed the wear of someone who'd struggled more than he'd succeeded. His brown hair was already thinning, and he had the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors. Hey, he said awkwardly, standing in the doorway of my hospital room like he wasn't sure he was welcome. Hey yourself, I replied, trying to sound more cheerful than I felt. The pain medication made everything feel fuzzy around the edges, but I could still sense the tension radiating from him. Thanks for coming. I know this isn't exactly convenient. He shrugged and pulled up the visitor's chair. It's fine. I took some time off work. Marcus worked as a computer technician for a small IT company in Colorado Springs, a job that paid the bills but never seemed to satisfy him. So what exactly do you need me to do? Dr. Hernandez had given me a detailed list of restrictions and requirements. No weight bearing on my left leg for 6 weeks, help with bathing and dressing for the first 2 weeks, assistance with grocery shopping and meal preparation, and transportation to follow-up appointments and physical therapy sessions. Basically, I need to be a burden, I said, trying to make light of it. I hate asking, but I really don't have anyone else. Something flickered across Marcus's face, an expression I couldn't quite read. Don't worry about it, he said. We're family. The discharge process took most of the day. Marcus had to learn how to help me transfer from bed to wheelchair, how to navigate stairs with crutches, and how to set up the various medical equipment I'd need at home. He was surprisingly patient during the training, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes on his phone. My apartment was a second-floor walk-up in a converted Victorian house, which I'd chosen for its character and proximity to downtown. Now, staring up at those 15 steps, they looked like Mount Everest. This is going to be interesting, Marcus muttered, eyeing the stairs. Maybe you should have thought about accessibility before you picked this place. The comment stung, partly because he was right, and partly because of the way he said it. Like my injury was somehow my fault for not anticipating it. But I was too tired and sore to argue, so I just focused on the slow, painful process of getting up to my front door. Inside, my normally cozy apartment felt different, smaller and more cluttered. Things I'd never thought about before, like the height of my kitchen cabinets or the narrow hallway to my bedroom, suddenly seemed like obstacles designed to make my life difficult. Marcus surveyed the space with the critical eye of someone evaluating a problem to be solved. You're going to need a lot of modifications, he said. Shower chair, grab bars, maybe a mini fridge for the living room so you don't have to go to the kitchen as much. I hadn't thought about all that, I admitted. The reality of my situation was starting to sink in, and it was overwhelming. Good thing I'm here, he said, and there was something in his tone that made me look at him more closely. He was already pulling out his phone, making a list of what we'd need to buy. The first week was brutal. Everything took forever and hurt more than I'd expected. Simple tasks like getting dressed or making a sandwich became major productions that left me exhausted. Marcus was helpful, but there was an efficiency to his assistance that felt more clinical than caring. He'd help me shower, but he'd check his watch while doing it. He'd make me meals, but he'd sigh if I asked for something different than what he'd planned. By the second week, I started noticing little things. Marcus had a small notebook that he wrote in frequently, though he'd always close it when I looked his way. When he went to the grocery store, he'd save every receipt and file them carefully in a folder he kept in his car. When he drove me to appointments, he'd make note of the mileage on a piece of paper he kept clipped to his sun visor. What's with all the record keeping? I finally asked one day as he helped me settle into bed after a particularly exhausting physical therapy session. Just staying organized, he said, not meeting my eyes. You know how I am about keeping track of things. I did know. Marcus had always been meticulous about money and possessions, probably because he'd had to be. While I'd been able to build a comfortable life, he'd always struggled financially. He still drove a 10-year-old Corolla and lived in a studio apartment that he'd once described as affordable but depressing. As the days passed, I began to sense a growing resentment in his actions. He'd slam cabinet doors a little too hard when he was cooking. He'd make pointed comments about how much my medications cost, or how many trips to the pharmacy he'd had to make. When I thanked him for his help, he'd just nod curtly and change the subject. Is everything okay? I asked him one evening, as he was getting ready to leave for his own apartment. He'd been staying with me during the day but going home at night, which meant he was basically commuting 2 hours daily on top of everything else. I'm fine, he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. Just tired, I guess. This is a lot more work than I expected. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. I know this is hard on you too. When I'm better, I'll find a way to make it up to you. That was when I saw it. A flash of something calculating in his eyes. Don't worry about it, he said. I'm keeping track of everything. At the time, I thought he meant he was keeping track so he'd remember this period fondly later, as proof that he'd been there for me when I needed him most. I had no idea he was literally keeping track of every dollar spent, every hour invested, every favor performed. I had no idea he was building a bill. By the fourth week of my recovery, the dynamic between Marcus and me had shifted dramatically. What had started as awkward but genuine help had evolved into something that felt more like a business arrangement. He'd arrive each morning at exactly 8:30, carrying his coffee and that mysterious notebook, and he'd leave each evening at precisely 6, regardless of whether I actually needed anything else. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when I was finally strong enough to attempt making my own breakfast. I'd been looking forward to this small step toward independence, but when Marcus walked in and saw me standing at the stove with my crutches, flipping pancakes, his face went dark. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp with irritation. "Making breakfast," I said, confused by his reaction. "I thought you'd be happy that I'm getting more mobile." "You could have fallen," he said. but there was something else in his tone, something that sounded almost like disappointment. What if you'd hurt yourself worse? What if you'd set the kitchen on fire? Marcus, I'm not helpless, I said, starting to feel frustrated. The doctor said I should gradually increase my activity level. Making pancakes seems like a reasonable step. He grabbed his notebook from the counter and started writing furiously. Fine, he said, but if something happens, don't expect me to deal with the consequences. That afternoon, while Marcus was out getting groceries, I decided to do some investigating. I felt guilty about it, but something about his behavior was bothering me more each day. His notebook was sitting on my coffee table, and I couldn't resist taking a look. What I found made my stomach drop. Page after page of meticulous entries, dated and itemized like a professional invoice. March 15th, gas to hospital and back, 47 miles at 0.67 per mile, $31.49. March 16th, groceries for invalid food, $73.82. March 17th, time spent helping with shower, 45 minutes at 25 hour, $18.75. March 18th, emotional support during crying episode, 1.5 hours at 50 hour, EQ 75 hours. I flipped through page after page, watching the numbers climb. He was charging me for everything. Not just expenses, but his time at rates he'd apparently assigned to different types of help. Basic care was $25 an hour. Emotional labor was $50 an hour. Emergency response for things like helping me up when I'd fallen was $100 per incident. The total at the bottom of the most recent page made me feel sick. $4,347.82. I heard his key in the door and quickly closed the notebook, my hands shaking. Marcus walked in carrying grocery bags, and I tried to act normal, but my mind was reeling. You okay? He asked, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. You look pale. Just tired, I managed to say. Over the next few days, I watched him with new eyes. Every kind gesture, every moment of care, every patient explanation of my medication schedule. It was all being recorded, quantified, and priced. When he helped me to the bathroom at night, I could practically see him calculating the overtime rate. When he stayed an extra hour because I was having a bad pain day, I knew he was adding it to my tab. The worst part was realizing that some of his help seemed designed to keep me dependent. When I suggested ordering delivery instead of having him cook, he'd insist that homemade food was better for my recovery, then charge me for the time spent cooking. When I mentioned that my neighbor had offered to drive me to physical therapy, he'd remind me that strangers couldn't be trusted with my medical needs, then bill me for the transportation. I started trying to do more things for myself, partly out of a desperate need to regain some independence, and partly to reduce whatever astronomical bill he was building. But every step toward self-sufficiency seemed to irritate him more. You're pushing yourself too hard, he'd say when I managed to shower alone. You're going to set back your recovery. The physical therapist said I'm ahead of schedule, I'd reply. Physical therapists don't see the whole picture, he'd argue. I'm the one who's here every day. I can see when you're overdoing it. The gaslighting was subtle, but persistent. When I mentioned that I felt ready to try driving short distances, he reminded me of every news story he'd ever heard about people re-injuring themselves by rushing back to normal activities. When I said I thought I could manage grocery shopping with a cart for support, he'd point out how crowded and dangerous stores could be for someone on crutches. Meanwhile, his notebook entries continued. I started sneaking looks whenever he left it unattended, watching the total climb higher each day. He was charging me for things that seemed increasingly ridiculous. $30 for consultation time. When I asked his opinion about which physical therapy exercises hurt the most. $45 for research when he looked up whether my pain medication could be taken with ibuprofen. By week 5, I was strong enough to have a serious conversation with myself about what was happening. This wasn't normal sibling support during a crisis. This was something else entirely. Something calculated and mercenary that was making me feel worse instead of better. But I still couldn't bring myself to confront him directly. He was my only help. And despite everything, I wasn't completely independent yet. More than that, he was my brother. Surely there was some explanation that would make this all make sense. Maybe he was keeping track of expenses to submit to my insurance company. Maybe he was documenting everything for tax purposes. Maybe there was some legitimate reason for what felt like a complete betrayal of family trust. I was wrong, of course, but I wouldn't find that out until it was too late to do anything about it. The reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, it would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The confrontation came on a sunny Tuesday morning in late April, exactly 6 weeks after my surgery. I'd just returned from my follow-up appointment with Dr. Hernandez, who had given me the green light to gradually return to normal activities. My bone was healing well, my range of motion was improving, and I was officially cleared to drive short distances and bear full weight on my leg. I was sitting on my couch, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in weeks. when Marcus walked in carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, part businessman, part nervous defendant. "We need to talk," he said, sitting down across from me with the folder in his lap. "Sure," I said, though something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "What's up?" He opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers that looked disturbingly official. The top sheet was typed and formatted like a professional invoice, complete with letterhead that read, "Marcus Thompson, Personal Care Services." "I've been keeping track of everything over the past 6 weeks," he said, his voice taking on a rehearsed quality. "All the expenses, all the time I've invested, all the sacrifices I've made to help you through this." I stared at the papers in his hands, feeling like I was watching a car accident in slow motion. "Marcus, what are you doing?" "I'm presenting you with an itemized account of the care services I've provided," he said, and I could hear him trying to sound professional and reasonable. "I think it's important that we settle this before you're fully recovered and we both move on with our lives." He handed me the papers, and I looked down at the most surreal document I'd ever seen. It was 8 pages long, single-spaced, with entries for every single day of my recovery. But seeing it laid out professionally, with official formatting and calculated subtotals, made it so much worse than the glimpses I'd caught in his notebook. Transportation services, 47 round trips to medical appointments, pharmacy visits, and grocery shopping. Total mileage, 1,127 miles at IRS standard rate of $0, 67 per mile, $755.09. Personal care assistance, 168 hours of bathing, dressing, and mobility support at $30 per hour, $5,040 an hour. Meal preparation and nutrition management, 84 meals prepared and served at $25 per meal, $2,100 hours. Emotional support and crisis intervention, 23 sessions of psychological support during pain episodes, anxiety attacks, and depressive episodes at $75 per hour, $1,725 hours. The list went on and on. He'd charged me for helping me up when I fell. He'd charged me for listening to me cry when the pain was bad. He'd charged me for calling to check on me when he wasn't there. He'd even charged me for consultation fees, for the conversations where I'd asked his advice about my recovery. At the bottom of the last page, in bold letters, was the total $12,847.63. I looked up at him, speechless. He was watching me with an expression that seemed to expect gratitude for his thoroughness. "Marcus," I finally managed, "this is insane. You're my brother." "Exactly," he said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "I'm your brother who dropped everything to take care of you for 6 weeks. I used up all my vacation time. I drove back and forth to Denver every single day. I put my own life on hold to make sure you had everything you needed. That has value, Nick. Real value. But I'm family," I said, feeling like I was stating the obvious. "Family helps family. That's what we do." His face hardened. "Family helps family when it goes both ways. When has it ever gone both ways with us, Nick? When have you ever sacrificed anything for me?" The question hit me like a slap. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about our whole lives," he said, his voice rising. "You've always been the golden child, the successful one, the one who gets everything handed to her. You got into college on scholarships while I had to take out loans I'm still paying off. You landed your dream job right out of school while I've been stuck in dead-end positions for years. You bought this nice apartment while I'm living in a studio that smells like mildew. That's not my fault," I said. But even as I said it, I could hear how defensive I sounded. "Isn't it?" he asked. "You've never once offered to help me. Never once asked if I needed anything. Never once thought about anyone but yourself. And then, the minute you need something, you call me up and expect me to drop everything and play the devoted brother." I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. "So this is revenge?" "This is fairness," he corrected. "This is me finally getting compensated for all the times I've been expected to give and give and give without getting anything back." "I never asked you to give anything," I said, my voice getting louder. "I never asked you to sacrifice your life for mine. You asked me to help," he said. "This is what help costs. This is what my time and energy and emotional labor are worth. And if you want to act like family doesn't matter when it comes to paying for services, then fine. We'll treat this like a business transaction." I looked down at the invoice again, my hands shaking. Some of the charges were so petty and vindictive that they made me feel sick. Emotional support during crying episode, $75. Patience during difficult personality moments, $50. Tolerance of ungrateful attitude, $100. "I can't pay this," I said quietly. "You make good money," he replied. "You can set up a payment plan." "Marcus, I can't pay this because it's wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. You don't charge your sister for helping her when she's injured and vulnerable." "Says who?" he asked. "Says the sister who's never had to be the one doing the helping?" The cruelty in his voice was like nothing I'd ever heard from him before. This wasn't my brother. This was a stranger wearing his face, demanding payment for basic human decency. I need to think about this, I said, setting the papers down with trembling hands. You have 2 weeks, he said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. After that, I'll have to consider other options for collecting what I'm owed. He walked to the door, then turned back. And Nick, don't think about going to Mom and Dad about this. I already talked to them. They agree that it's time you learn to appreciate what people do for you. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone with the most devastating document I'd ever seen, a bill for being loved by my own brother. I sat there for a long time, staring at those 8 pages and trying to understand how my life had become something I no longer recognized. Outside, Denver was getting on with its day, but inside my apartment, everything had changed forever. The call to my parents was the hardest phone call I'd ever made. I waited 3 days after Marcus's ultimatum, hoping against hope that this was all some kind of cruel joke or misunderstanding. But when I finally dialed their number in Wichita, my mother's voice confirmed my worst fears. "Oh, honey," she said when I explained the situation, her tone carrying that particular mixture of disappointment and resignation I remembered from childhood. "Marcus told us you might call about this. Mom, he's trying to charge me almost $13,000 for helping me recover from surgery," I said, my voice breaking. "He's my brother. How can you possibly think this is okay?" There was a long pause. "Nick, sweetheart, I think you need to look at this from Marcus's perspective. He's always struggled, and you've always had everything come so easily. Maybe it's time you understood what it costs when people sacrifice for you." "Sacrifice?" I repeated, incredulous. "He's charging me $75 for listening to me cry. He's billing me for emotional labor. This isn't sacrifice. It's exploitation." "That's not how your father and I see it," she said, her voice getting firmer. "Marcus has been there for you every single day for 6 weeks. He used up all his vacation time, he drove hundreds of miles, he put his own life on hold. And what have you ever done for him?" The question felt like a punch to the gut because I couldn't immediately answer it. What had I done for Marcus? I'd sent him birthday cards, called on holidays, invited him to visit Denver a few times. But had I ever really been there for him the way he'd been there for me during my recovery? "I've been a good sister," I said weakly. "Have you?" my mother asked. "When Marcus lost his job 2 years ago, did you offer to help? When he was going through his divorce, did you check in on him? When he was struggling to make rent, did you even know about it?" I hadn't known about any of those things. Marcus had never told me, and I'd never asked. I'd been so focused on building my own life that I'd barely paid attention to his struggles. "But Mom," I said, "even if I could have been a better sister, that doesn't make this right. You don't charge family for basic human kindness." "Maybe not," she said, "but you also don't take it for granted. Your father and I think Marcus has a point. You've always assumed that people would be there for you without considering what it costs them." The conversation ended with my mother suggesting that I pay Marcus what I could afford and apologize for not appreciating his sacrifice. I hung up feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Over the next week, I did a lot of thinking. I thought about my relationship with Marcus, about the family dynamics that had shaped us both, about the ways I might have contributed to his resentment without realizing it. I examined my own behavior and found things I wasn't proud of, moments of selfishness, times when I'd been too focused on my own success to notice other people's struggles. But I also thought about what healthy relationships look like, about the difference between accountability and manipulation, about the line between making amends and being exploited. I made a decision. I called Marcus and asked him to meet me at a coffee shop in downtown Denver. He arrived carrying his folder of invoices, probably expecting me to hand over a check or propose a payment plan. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, "and you're right about some things. I haven't been the most attentive sister. I've been so focused on my own life that I haven't paid enough attention to yours. I'm sorry for that." His expression brightened slightly. "I'm glad you can see that. But," I continued, "I'm not going to pay your bill." His face hardened. "Nick, we had an agreement." "No, we didn't. You presented me with a bill after the fact, without my consent or knowledge. That's not an agreement, that's an ambush." I pulled out my own folder, one I'd spent the week preparing. "I've done some research on what professional caregiving actually costs. Home health aides in Denver charge between $15 and $25 per hour. You charged me $30 to $75. Personal care assistants don't typically charge extra for emotional support. That's part of the basic service. And family members who provide care can request reimbursement for actual expenses, but not for their time. I'm not a professional caregiver," he said. "I'm your brother who gave up his life for you. You're my brother who kept detailed records of every moment of care so you could bill me for it later," I replied. If you'd told me up front that you expected payment, I would have hired a professional instead. I opened my folder and showed him what I'd prepared. Here's what I'm willing to do. I'll reimburse you for your actual expenses. Gas, parking, meals you bought for me, medical supplies. The total comes to $437. I'll also write you a check for another $500 as a thank you for your time and effort. That's not even close to what you owe me, he said, his voice rising. It's not what I owe you, I said. It's what I'm willing to give you. There's a difference. He stood up abruptly. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're selfish and entitled, and you always have been. Maybe, I said, staying seated and keeping my voice calm. But I'm not stupid, and I'm not going to let you manipulate me into paying for basic human decency. He stormed out of the coffee shop, and I knew our relationship was probably over. It hurt more than I'd expected, but it also felt like the right decision. 3 months later, I was fully recovered and back to my normal life. I'd returned to work, resumed my social activities, and even started dating someone new, a kind, genuine man who would never dream of charging me for emotional support. I never heard from Marcus again, though my mother called occasionally to suggest that I should reconsider paying him. I always politely declined and changed the subject. The experience taught me important lessons about boundaries, about the difference between being accountable and being exploited, about the toxic dynamics that can exist even in families. It also taught me to be more aware of other people's struggles and more intentional about showing appreciation for the people who care about me. But most importantly, it taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst behavior, even when that someone is family. I keep the copy of Marcus's invoice in my filing cabinet, not as a reminder of his betrayal, but as a reminder of my own strength. The day I refused to pay that bill was the day I learned to value myself enough to demand better treatment, even from the people who are supposed to love me unconditionally. Some prices are too high to pay, even for family, especially for family.